Hey, how's it going, guys? I am Jack, and this is Subjectively Speaking, the show where we discuss character design through a subjective lens. This means that a lot of what I'll be saying here is my opinion, and it's open for discussion, so please leave your thoughts on the video down in the comments and start a conversation. Also be sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out this week's deals from Blick. And with that, let's get on with the video. Okay, let's start big here. The fantasy genre. Yeah, it's huge. It's massive. It's almost not even a genre at this point. It's more like a design motif. And yeah, it's very, very popular. It has been for decades. A lot of what we consider to be high fantasy nowadays can be attributed to the author of the Lord of the Rings series, J.R.R. Tolkien. And as popular as his books were at the time, I'm not sure he could ever know just how much his stories would influence writers to this day. While Tolkien drew much of his inspiration from Arthurian myths and legends, developers of games like Dungeons & Dragons looked to Lord of the Rings for the inspiration of their designs. And the generation that grew up playing D&D went on to create video games like the Elder Scrolls and so on and so forth. Things like wizards, dwarves, elves, and orcs, they were all popularized by Tolkien. And we're all so familiar with these character tropes because they're really easy to use, and a lot of storytellers like to use them. Orcs, in particular, are a character trope so often used in fantasy that it's hard to think of a story in the genre that doesn't include them in some capacity.
That isn't very nice.
The very concept is thought to be initially conceived by Tolkien, his work being the first to describe such creatures. And what he created is such a solid concept, it's ingrained itself into our vocabulary. But just in case you're not familiar, an orc is a fictional humanoid creature that is part of a fantasy race akin to goblins, and are used in storytelling to personify an emotionless yet human-like force of aggression, often with immense physical power and brutality. Basically, they're the bullies of the fantasy genre, and this concept has been used as an easy out for writers of fantasy whenever they need a bad guy who's just slightly less scary than the actual antagonist of the story. Now, orcs have been used a lot of different ways over the years, and the best stories in the genre have found ways to reapply these and other tropes in ways that give the audience a fresh take on the concept. The Elder Scrolls, for example, treat orcs in their story as a race and a culture in the land of Tamriel. They abide by many of the Tolkien tropes in their physical appearance and mannerisms, but like most things in the Elder Scrolls series, there's so much depth to their history and culture that allows the audience to enjoy the concept at a much deeper level. You can even play as one.
You from one of the strongholds, Orc. How did you end up here?
Spyro, another, albeit a very different game in the fantasy genre, goes in the opposite direction. They use orcs, or Norks as they're called in the series, the same way that the Mario series uses Koopas. They're charming, simple in their design, and serve the role of a punching bag in the game. In either case, the character design tropes are retooled in each game to fit the role that they will play in that world. But other stories take a more difficult route, the path of high concept and development. Some stories elect not to use these tropes at all. Games that not only utilize pre-existing tropes to their fullest extent, but also invent new conventions to inspire the next generation of storytellers. Games like Dark Souls. Dark Souls, along with its two sequels, is the brainchild of game developer and president of FromSoft Games, Hidetaka Miyazaki. The first in the franchise was a spiritual successor to another FromSoft game, Demon's Souls, and the two share many similarities in terms of both game design and art direction. Miyazaki has a very interesting background as a game developer. As a child, he was raised in a very poor family, and his parents encouraged him to study hard. He was also forbidden from playing video games, ironically enough, and instead enjoyed reading, writing, and playing tabletop RPGs such as, you guessed it, Dungeons & Dragons. At a young age, Miyazaki had been exposed to and engulfed in the realm of fantasy, and during a brief stint as an account manager for a US corporation, he was recommended the 2001 action-adventure game Ico. Miyazaki accredits his interest in the video game industry to this game, and like Dungeons & Dragons, Ico exists in the fantasy genre. Unlike D&D, however, Ico breaks a lot of the pre-existing conventions of traditional high fantasy, and uses the medium of video games to create a whole new world, inspired by, but not copying, previous works of fantasy. Miyazaki went on to work with FromSoft and helped design Demon's Souls, which, in the eyes of the company, was actually perceived as a failure. Miyazaki went on to say, I figured if I could find a way to take control of the game, I could turn it into anything I wanted. Best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure. So that's what he did. He went on to direct the spiritual successor to the game, Dark Souls, in 2011, and the overwhelming success of the game was enough to get him promoted to the president of FromSoft 3 years later. There were a lot of things that made Dark Souls such a successful game. Its gameplay, its difficulty, and its unique player versus player mechanics all broadened its audience, and there was really something in it for everyone. But of course, we're not talking about all of that. I am definitely not the guy to break down the PvP in Dark Souls. My strat is just to use the biggest hammer. No, the thing that attracted me, and a lot of other people to this series, is the wildly unique art direction used in each game. It's one of the most iconic video games in terms of its style, which is really interesting considering how many other popular fantasy video games exist out there that have been kind of lost to time. When designing his games, Miyazaki drew inspiration from the creative works of storytellers that came before him. A few such examples include The Legend of Zelda, Berserk, and the written fiction of authors George R.R. Martin and H.P. Lovecraft. All of these stories have their own unique sense of world building too, and are iconic staples of the fantasy genre. But, of course, Dark Souls has a completely different feel from all of these other works. When creating a world for any form of storytelling, it's crucial to be able to synthesize your inspirations from pre-existing stories into something new, something just as impactful that borrows from these worlds, without overusing the same tired tropes, and even creating some new conventions of your own. Dark Souls does just that. Dark Souls is a fantasy game, without a doubt. It builds off of pre-existing concepts, and uses such themes in its art direction as Gothic architecture, Arthurian legends, and the social constructs of feudal-era Europe. But what sets it apart in the genre is how it uses these concepts uniquely, and in some ways, breaks a lot of the conventions we're used to seeing in fantasy. You don't rescue the princess to save the kingdom. You don't carry the ring and destroy the great evil plaguing the land. You don't slay the dragon. Well, actually no, you do slay a few dragons. Oh, yeah, you do. That's somewhat inaccurate. But these aren't the driving motivations for the player. In fact, the lore of the game is so convoluted, it's hard to really tell what your motivation as a player is. For most, this driving force is exploration. To discover that new area or weapon, or finding the next boss that you'll grind for a week until you figure out the best way to beat it. And Miyazaki knew that this, not a linear story with a predictable ending, would be what kept his players interested. So, let's backstep a bit. Put yourself in the mind of a game director. We're designing a game that is going to use the fantasy genre as a visual motif, but our player will not be the knight in shining armor that we're used to seeing. Instead, the player will be whoever they want to be, and play however they want to play. This world is theirs for the discovering, so on our part as the game developer, we will do as little as possible to inhibit their immersion. And the enemies in this game will not be the straightforward and easy to understand baddies that we so often see in fantasy. We want the player to be confused and intrigued right up until the point the enemy is rearing up to attack. Enemies that look one way at a certain angle and completely different from another. Creatures that remind us of things we've seen before, but reimagined in such ways that we're almost stunned by what we're looking at. Their intentions will be unclear. Are they attacking the player because they are savage, mindless beasts? Or are they following some code of an ancient covenant of righteous knights? Maybe their design will force the player to wonder if they're even the good guy in this story. In some cases, these creatures will be just so inexplicably bizarre that it's almost not worth trying to figure out what the hell they're supposed to be. Maybe fear is the only thing our player needs to feel at this moment, and fear them they will. In other words, no orcs allowed. Orcs are simple.
Simple?
Straightforward, and easy for an audience to understand.
That does it!
Sure, you could design them in ways that are scary, or even a little mysterious, but in the end, an audience in the 21st century is going to be far more invested in something whose design implies ambiguity, instead of something they're already familiar with. I'm not saying that using orcs in your fantasy world is a sin, or that any other pre-existing design convention of the fantasy genre is a cop-out. All of these things are important in inspiring and shaping your world in the early stages of development. Writers need inspiration to create something new, but what you need to keep in mind when creating your story is the themes and intent of this world, and how you want your audience to interact with it. If your story is meant to parody the genre, then you should use these character tropes at their base most level, and use character design to create something that perhaps exaggerates them to a point of ridiculousness. But if your intent is to create something new, something that breaks all the rules and makes up its own, then you need to be able to design a world that does this too. In any and all cases, your character design needs to reflect your theme, and those that do so successfully are the ones that will be remembered for years to come. The fantasy genre will never die, and by no means should it. It allows storytellers to create their world without the limitations of reality, or even within the confines of science. It will, however, continue to change and evolve, and the tropes that we're familiar with now might be completely rethought in generations to come. Stories that break the rules today will set them for tomorrow, and the storytellers who do this will be remembered for centuries to come. Hidetaka Miyazaki will surely be remembered as one of these great storytellers, mastering this new medium called video games to create a world so unique and impactful, it's hard not to compare new games to it. Dark Souls presents a slew of brand new concepts and inspirations for the next wave of creators to run with, and see how far their ideas will go. You could be that next creator, and you don't need to be the president of a successful video game company to do it. After all, Miyazaki just started off as some kid who wasn't allowed to play video games at all. He was just a guy with a book and a few good ideas who somehow managed to produce one of the most successful game titles of our time. And he did it without even a single orc. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please throw me a like and subscribe for more. And be sure to share it with your friends. Oh, and we would love to see some of the stuff you guys have been making. If you have artwork you'd like to share with us, tag us on Instagram and we will feature it in one of our videos. Thanks again guys. I will see you in the next video. I also found this image while looking for Dark Souls stuff. There was no place to put it in the video, but I still wanted to have it in it because it's, I don't know what that is. Maybe you could buy this. I don't know. A little Xyz monster in there. I'd buy it.